This channel does not promote or encourage any illegal activities. All contents provided by the channel is meant for educational purpose only.
In 1831, deep in the plantations of Mississippi, a man named Solomon Reed was born, with a height and strength that defied nature. By the time he was 18, he stood 7 feet 8 inches tall, weighing over 350 pounds. Plantation owners whispered he was part beast, part devil, but to the enslaved, he was a symbol of hope. When Solomon's rage erupted after witnessing the murder of his family, he did the unthinkable. He fought back. His rebellion would ignite one of the most terrifying legends in Southern history. A man so feared that masters abandoned their homes at the mere rumor of his approach. In the humid summer of 1831, in the small Virginia county of Southampton, a woman named Eliza Reed went into labor inside a worn-out slave cabin. Her cries echoed through the fields, mixing with the sound of cicadas and distant thunder. By the time the storm cleared, a child had been born, one that the midwives whispered was too large, too strong, too strange to be real. The child's name was Solomon, and from the very beginning, Solomon Reed was unlike any other. When most infants fit gently in their mother's arms, Solomon's hands were already as large as a man's. By the time he turned 5, he could lift a barrel of water that grown men struggled to move. His master, Thomas Hale, would bring guests from neighboring plantations to witness the boy with the hands of a giant. Some laughed in amusement, others looked uneasy. In a world built on control and fear, an enslaved child that strong was a threat waiting to happen. As Solomon grew, so did his legend. By 16, he stood 7 feet 2 inches, his shoulders as wide as the doorway of the barn. His voice was deep, calm, and quiet, but when he shouted across the field, his words carried for miles. The other enslaved men admired him, but they also feared for him. They'd whisper, "The bigger you get, the faster they'll want to break you." And they were right. Thomas Hale saw Solomon not as a man, but as a spectacle. He hired out Solomon to nearby plantations, earning money from his size and strength. Hale made him fight other enslaved men for entertainment, promising food or scraps as reward. But Solomon never fought with hatred. He fought to survive. And each time after the fight ended, he would help his opponent stand back up. This quiet defiance began to spread through the quarters like wildfire. The enslaved started calling him Big Sol, while overseers whispered a different name, the Devil's Child. In 1851, the South trembled with paranoia. Rumors of slave revolt spread after Nat Turner's rebellion years earlier. When a group of enslaved men were caught planning an escape from Hale's plantation, Hale accused Solomon of leading them, without proof. The punishment was brutal. Solomon was tied to a wooden frame, whipped over 100 times, his back torn and bleeding. But he didn't scream. Not once. Witnesses later said the silence was worse than a scream. That night, Solomon vanished. No one saw him leave, but by dawn 3 overseers were found dead, their necks broken. The barn was on fire. And the name, the Giant of Virginia, was born. Over the next decade, stories spread from Virginia to Mississippi. Farmers claimed to see a shadowy giant moving through the woods at night, freeing slaves and burning storehouses. he became a legend, a myth, a ghost story to slave masters. Plantation owners would tell their children, "Sleep early or the giant will come." But for the enslaved, Solomon was a savior, the one who fought back. They passed down songs about him in secret, old spirituals that carried his story. Ain't no chain can bind his soul, ain't no whip can break his will. By 1860, as the Civil War neared, soldiers claimed they'd seen a man nearly 8 feet tall among Union lines, helping freed men cross to safety. Was it Solomon? No one could say for sure. His name never appeared in any record, but his legend survived in whispers. After the war ended, the story of Solomon Reed faded into silence. No official documents mention him. No gravestone bears his name. But in a forgotten cemetery near Natchez, Mississippi, a caretaker once found an unmarked grave, longer than any he'd ever seen. Carved faintly into the wood was a single word: Sol. Was Solomon Reed real, or a legend born of hope and rage? Historians debate to this day, but among descendants of the enslaved in the Deep South, one belief remains. Somewhere, a giant once walked among us, a man who reminded the world that even in chains, a spirit that powerful can never be broken.
By the time the first shots of the Civil War echoed through the South in 1861, most had forgotten the name Solomon Reed. To a new generation, he was a whisper, a fireside ghost story told by aging plantation hands. But in the shadows of the war that tore America apart, that legend began to breathe again. After the mysterious fires of Virginia in 1851, Solomon had vanished. Slave catchers scoured the forests for weeks until they reached the Blackwater Swamp, where the trail ended in footprints too large to be a man's. For nearly a decade, no one spoke his name openly. Those who did whispered it like a prayer. Some said Solomon crossed into the north through the Underground Railroad, aided by Quakers who believed he was a sign of divine vengeance. Others claimed he lived deep in the Mississippi swamps, protecting escaped men and women from bounty hunters. No record confirms either story. But what surfaced next would etch his name into history once more. In 1862, a Union officer, Captain Alton Graves, wrote in his journal about an encounter near the Tennessee border. He described a towering colored man, near 8 feet tall, wearing a torn Confederate coat and carrying a rifle as long as his arm. The man approached their camp silently, leading 2 children and a wounded woman who had escaped from a plantation in Alabama. When asked his name, he simply said Saul. He refused pay, refused shelter, and asked only for food and medicine for those he brought. The captain wrote that even the toughest soldiers stepped aside when he passed. Word spread quickly through the Union lines: a phantom, a protector, a giant in tattered gray. To the soldiers, he became known as the Black Titan. As Northern forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, panic spread among Southern planters. In towns like Natchez, Vicksburg, and Selma, rumors swirled. The giant is coming. He frees slaves, burns barns, and vanishes into the night. Letters from that era reveal how seriously the myth was taken. One Mississippi merchant wrote that plantations stood empty come dusk and men slept with rifles by their beds while the slaves sang strange songs about a man with fire in his hands. The Confederacy dismissed the story as superstition, yet patrols were sent into the woods. None ever caught him. A few never returned at all. One of the few confirmed events linked to the legend occurred in late 1863 near the Red River. Union scouts discovered a plantation estate burned to the ground. The overseer and his men were dead, but instead of chaos, they found something else. Enormous, barefoot prints leading from the ruins to the riverbank, alongside dozens of smaller footprints, women, children, elders. Across the river were faint wagon wheel marks from Union supply trains. That same week, several newly freed families arrived at a Union fort saying only that the big man had shown them the way. The descriptions matched perfectly. A towering man, quiet, scarred, with eyes like storm clouds. As the legend grew, the Confederate government placed a $10,000 reward, a fortune then, for anyone who could bring in the Negro rebel called Solomon the Giant, dead or alive. But the more they hunted him, the larger the myth became. Songs were sung about him in fields and camps. Tall as a pine, dark as the night, he walks with the Lord and fights the fight. Children born into slavery grew up hearing his name whispered before bedtime. One day, the giant will come and the chains will fall. In 1864, as the war neared its end, a Union nurse named Mary Caldwell recorded a strange memory. She was tending to wounded soldiers near Natchez when a massive figure arrived at night carrying an unconscious boy on his shoulder. His clothes were torn, his hands scarred with whip marks. He said quietly, "He's just a boy. He deserves to live." When Mary turned to fetch water, the man was gone. All she saw were enormous footprints in the mud leading toward the woods. A year later she wrote again, saying she did not know if he was man or myth, but she had never forgotten those eyes. They held centuries of pain and something like peace. When freedom finally came, the legend of Solomon Reed became a symbol of strength, a story told at gatherings, churches, and freedom celebrations. Some claimed he died fighting bounty hunters near Vicksburg. Others said he disappeared into the northern mountains. Among freed families, one belief persisted. He walks when he's needed. He doesn't die. He waits. In the decades after the war, researchers and journalists tried to uncover the truth. Was Solomon a real man or a symbol created to embody resistance? Records from plantations near Southampton list a Solomon Reed, born 1831, sold in 1849 to a trader bound for Mississippi. After that, nothing. Yet oral histories collected in the early 1900s mention a man called Saul. One elder told an interviewer, "He was more than flesh. He was a spirit God sent, so we'd know we could fight back." Every war leaves its shadows, not all of them written in books or carved into monuments. Some survive only in stories, in the rhythm of old songs, and in the silent pride of those who remember. Solomon Reed may never have worn a uniform or stood on a battlefield lined with flags, but in the dark corners of America's fight for freedom, he was the war. A war of spirit, survival, and defiance, waged not for glory, but for the right to exist. And in that war, the giant still walks.
By 1865, the war had ended, and America began the long and painful process of Reconstruction. Cities were rebuilding, plantations were abandoned, and formerly enslaved people were finding their feet in a world that had promised freedom but offered little support. Yet even as the nation struggled to heal, whispers of Solomon Reed, the giant of Virginia, persisted in the shadows. His name had become a secret talisman among freedmen. Some spoke it in hushed tones, some in songs, and some in letters passed hand to hand. Everyone who mentioned him agreed on one thing: Solomon had survived the war, but no one knew where he had gone. The first hints of his post-war existence appeared in private journals, letters, and newspapers that reported unusual sightings. In Natchez, Mississippi, a local newspaper described a mysterious man seen aiding freed families to safety during the chaos at the end of the war. The reporter's description was simple but unmistakable. A man of towering height, nearly 8 feet tall, dressed in ragged clothes, moving with a quiet authority. The man had vanished into the woods before anyone could approach him, leaving only giant footprints behind. The article noted that the man seemed not only unnaturally large, but unnervingly calm, as if nothing in the world could frighten him. Historians who later unearthed these papers were fascinated. The accounts were consistent across multiple towns, from Natchez to Vicksburg and even as far north as Memphis. Witnesses described similar events, Solomon appearing at critical moments, guiding the weak and defenseless to safety, confronting those who would do harm, and then disappearing without a trace. One family claimed he had carried a small child across a river that even experienced men feared to cross. The child's mother wrote in her diary that she could still hear his deep, calm voice guiding them as they moved through the darkness. It was a voice that seemed to belong to no ordinary man. As these stories circulated, a small number of former soldiers, both Union and Confederate, began recording their own encounters. Captain Alton Graves, whose earlier journal had chronicled an initial sighting during the war, wrote another entry in 1866. He described encountering a massive man in the woods near a burned plantation. The man was alone, barefoot, and his clothing was torn and patched in dozens of places. He carried no weapons, yet Graves admitted he had felt an instinctive fear, a primal recognition of power. When Graves tried to speak, the man only nodded once, turned, and disappeared into the forest. Graves would later write that he never saw anyone like him again, and he doubted anyone ever would. The most compelling evidence came from what came to be called the Lost Files. These were a collection of letters, private journals, and personal accounts gathered between 1865 and 1875 by local historians and clergy in the South. The files were fragmentary, inconsistent, and often contradictory, but together they painted a picture of a man who had lived through the horrors of slavery, the chaos of war, and the chaos of Reconstruction, yet had emerged as a guardian figure for those who could not protect themselves. One entry, written by an elderly former enslaved woman, described Solomon carrying a wounded man from a collapsing cabin during a skirmish between desperate Confederate holdouts and marauding bands of outlaws. The woman wrote that she could not believe a man of his size could move so quickly and silently. She wrote, "He was as gentle as a summer breeze with us, but the men who sought to harm us fell back like leaves in a storm." Other accounts suggested that Solomon had become a symbol of justice, a guardian figure whose very presence forced oppressors to reconsider their actions. One report from a northern minister who had visited Vicksburg noted that freed families referred to Solomon simply as the one who walks among us. When pressed for details, the minister recorded that the locals spoke as if he were part spirit, part man. The minister himself, skeptical by nature, admitted that he found it difficult to explain how a man of Solomon's reported size and strength could survive the war undetected, moving with such speed and elusiveness. Yet he could not dismiss the consistency of the stories. In 1870, a former Confederate officer named William Thorne wrote a letter describing an encounter in the Mississippi swamps.
Thorne had been hunting runaway slaves when he came across a massive figure emerging from the mist. According to Thorne, the man's height and build were extraordinary, and that he had stopped Thorne without uttering a word. He described the encounter as terrifying, writing that he had felt a wave of awe and fear unlike anything he had experienced in battle. Thorne fled and reportedly never attempted to pursue Solomon again. His letter, along with several corroborating accounts from freedmen and travelers in the region, was added to what would later be called the Lost Files. One particularly intriguing portion of the Lost Files involved correspondence from Union Army veterans who had been stationed near Natchez, Mississippi. They reported that after the war, small groups of freed families would sometimes arrive at their camps under the protection of an enormous figure. The veterans noted that the man had a distinctive way of moving silently through the terrain and seemed to have knowledge of the land that suggested he had spent years navigating forests, rivers, and swamps. According to their letters, he carried no weapons, yet criminals and former Confederate soldiers would often abandon pursuit at the first sight of him. The veterans called him the Protector, while the families he aided called him simply Saul. Despite the consistency of these reports, no physical evidence could be produced. Photographs were rare and poorly documented, and there were no legal records to confirm his identity. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned the giant figure, often in exaggerated terms, but none could be definitively tied to Solomon. Yet the oral histories persisted. Families who had been assisted by him passed the story to their children, often framing it as both a warning and a lesson. If you do wrong, beware the one who walks unseen. He sees all, and he protects those who cannot fight for themselves. One entry in the Lost Files stood out for its eerie specificity. It was a letter from 1872 written by a freedman named Elijah Harper, who described a meeting with Solomon in the dense woods near a plantation along the Mississippi River. Harper wrote that Solomon had guided him and several other men through dangerous territory, avoiding Confederate holdouts and bandits. Harper described him as gentle and deliberate with those he protected, but like a storm to anyone who dares harm the innocent. Harper concluded his letter with a haunting observation. "I do not know if he is a man or a spirit, but I do know he walks still wherever he is needed." Additional letters suggested that Solomon occasionally interacted with northern missionaries and philanthropists who were aiding freedmen in the South. He was described as carrying supplies across dangerous areas and delivering them to those in need. Witnesses consistently remarked on his enormous size, his strength, and the striking calmness that accompanied his movements. Despite attempts to contact him directly, he was always elusive, vanishing into the forests or swamps before anyone could engage him in conversation. Over time, the Lost Files accumulated accounts of increasing wonder and reverence. One story, told by a group of freed children, described seeing a shadowy giant moving silently along the banks of the Mississippi River at dusk. According to their testimony, he would appear, guide lost travelers to safety, and disappear without leaving footprints, as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Adults who witnessed the events added weight to these stories, confirming the sighting of a man of extraordinary height who seemed impossible to capture. Scholars would later debate whether these reports were embellished or literal truth, but the sheer volume of accounts made it clear that the legend persisted. By the mid-1870s, the Lost Files had become both a historical resource and a cultural artifact.
They were collected, copied, and circulated by historians, journalists, and clergy who hoped to preserve the memory of Solomon Reed. The files painted a picture of a man who transcended ordinary human limits, someone who had endured the brutality of slavery, the horrors of war, and the chaos of Reconstruction, yet had emerged as a guardian figure for those who could not protect themselves. The lost files suggested that Solomon's true impact may have been less about physical violence and more about the moral power he embodied. He represented hope, justice, and defiance in a world that had systematically sought to deny these qualities to the enslaved. Even decades later, oral histories continued to mention him. In the early 1900s, researchers traveling through Mississippi recorded stories from the descendants of freedmen. These descendants told of a man who would appear in times of trouble, towering over all, yet moving with an almost supernatural grace. Families would invoke his name in prayer and song, teaching their children that Solomon Reed was not merely a man, but a symbol. "He walks with us still," they would say. "He is our protector, our giant, our strength." No verified records exist detailing Solomon's final years. Some historians speculate he may have moved north, seeking solitude in the forests of the Midwest. Others suggest he remained in the South, quietly helping those in need until he passed away unnoticed. Yet the absence of physical evidence has not diminished his legend. Solomon Reed lives on in the lost files, in the songs and stories of the freedmen, and in the whispered warnings and inspiration passed down through generations. His life demonstrates the enduring power of courage and resilience, proving that even in the darkest times, one individual, towering in strength and spirit, can leave an indelible mark on history. The lost files also contained hints of a final encounter. One 1875 letter described a meeting between an elderly Solomon and a young man who had been orphaned during the war. Solomon is said to have offered advice, counsel, and protection before vanishing into the wilderness once more. The young man reportedly spent the rest of his life recounting the meeting, insisting that Solomon's presence had changed him forever. The letter concluded with the words, "He is more than flesh. He is a guardian, and he walks still." Thus, even as the nation moved on from the Civil War and Reconstruction, Solomon Reed's story remained alive. He became a symbol of resistance, hope, and moral strength. Whether a man or myth, his legend endured through the lost files, passed down in letters, oral histories, and personal accounts, preserving the story of the giant of Virginia for generations to come. In the years following the war, Solomon Reed became more than a man. He became a shadow that moved unseen, a phantom walking among the freedmen and the fearful alike. Witnesses reported seeing him at night, crossing open fields with a calm, deliberate pace, carrying supplies, guiding lost travelers, or quietly confronting those who threatened the weak. His presence was never aggressive unless he was provoked, yet those who encountered him could not forget the overwhelming sense of authority he carried. One former soldier recalled seeing Solomon step silently into a clearing where armed men threatened a family of freedmen. The soldier wrote that the assailants froze at the sight of Solomon, as if the forest itself had risen to protect the innocent. Travelers passing through Mississippi and Louisiana told similar stories. He appeared on riverbanks, in forests, and along abandoned plantations, always moving with purpose. Children who witnessed him described his enormous hands and broad shoulders, his calm voice, and the gentle way he guided them away from danger. Adults,
especially those with past allegiances to the Confederacy, spoke of him with a mix of fear and awe. The consensus was consistent. Solomon Reed was no ordinary man, and his legend had only grown in the post-war years. One particularly vivid account comes from a freedman named Joseph Carter, who described encountering Solomon near the outskirts of Vicksburg in 1870. Carter wrote that he had become lost while trying to reach his family across the river. Solomon appeared silently, guiding Carter through dense undergrowth, past abandoned homes and fields still littered with the debris of war. Carter recalled the calm authority in Solomon's voice as he instructed him to stay close, warning that danger still lurked, even in the absence of soldiers. Carter later wrote that he believed Solomon could have walked through armies unnoticed, that his presence alone was a shield. Stories of his post-war interventions spread quickly among freed communities. Some families claimed he would appear just in time to protect children from bandits. Others said he warned settlers of impending natural disasters or guided families through swamps to safety during flooding. Each account added to the legend, portraying him as both protector and ghostly guardian. Yet no one ever caught him, photographed him, or documented him formally. The mystery remained absolute. In parallel, Southern newspapers occasionally reported sightings, though the tone varied. Conservative publications dismissed them as tall tales or exaggerations, while more sensationalist newspapers treated the events as miraculous or terrifying. One 1871 article described a colossal figure roaming the night, freeing slaves and punishing wrongdoers, though by that time slavery had ended. The article reflected the lingering fear and fascination surrounding the legend. Readers wrote letters claiming first-hand experiences, reinforcing the myth of Solomon Reed as an unstoppable force of moral authority. As the 1870s progressed, Solomon's legend became entwined with other stories of giants and protectors in the South. Travelers and freed families often confused or merged accounts, yet patterns remained: a towering figure, extraordinary strength, calm demeanor, moral clarity, and sudden, inexplicable appearances. The lost files preserved these narratives, compiling them in handwritten notes, letters, and journals, creating a tapestry of experiences that could not be fully verified but remained consistent in tone and message. It is in this period that the notion of Solomon as the Phantom of the South took hold. He became a cautionary figure to those who would exploit the weak, a protector to those who had nowhere else to turn. His story was passed orally, embedded in songs and spirituals, with subtle details changing with each retelling, yet always maintaining the central truth: a giant man walked unseen, guiding, protecting, and punishing when necessary.
In 1873, a Union veteran named Thomas Mallory described encountering Solomon while traveling through the Mississippi swamps. Mallory had been searching for a group of children lost during the seasonal flooding. According to his letter, he stumbled upon a figure moving along the riverbank, carrying a child on his shoulder. Mallory wrote that he recognized the immense size and the deliberate, almost silent gait of the man. The man spoke softly to the children, instructing them to hold his hand and follow carefully. When Mallory approached to offer assistance, the giant simply nodded and continued walking into the woods, leaving Mallory and the children unharmed and guided safely to higher ground. Similar accounts came from Louisiana. Families recalled a towering man leading them away from burning homesteads during local disputes, always appearing at critical moments. In every case, witnesses emphasized his height, strength, and silent authority. He was never violent unless confronted with aggression. His moral presence, combined with physical power, created an aura of both reverence and fear.
Historians analyzing these reports later noted that Solomon Reed's post-war legend served as a bridge between the trauma of slavery and the promise of freedom, embodying both vengeance against oppressors and protection for the vulnerable. The lost files also contained evidence suggesting that Solomon occasionally interacted with northern relief organizations, quietly transporting supplies, medicine, and food to remote communities. Letters from relief workers describe an enormous man arriving in the night, unloading packages, and vanishing before questions could be asked. His actions were consistent with the moral code attributed to him in previous accounts: aid the vulnerable, confront injustice, and remain unseen when possible. By the late 1870s, reports of Solomon's sightings became increasingly rare, though they did not cease entirely. Families who had been helped continued to tell the story to their children, embedding the giant in the cultural memory of the South. In some cases, these accounts merged with other local legends of giants or supernatural figures, but the consistency of Solomon's characteristics, height, strength, moral authority, and elusiveness remained intact. Historians of the early 20th century attempted to track down any official record or evidence of Solomon Reed. Plantation records were incomplete or destroyed, photographs were absent, and census data could not confirm his presence. Yet oral histories persisted, often with remarkable consistency across multiple counties and generations. Some researchers suggested that he may have lived in isolation, using the forests and swamps as cover to continue his protective work. Others posited that his life was deliberately obscured, either by his own design or by the chaos of post-war Reconstruction. Even in the 1880s, the legend of Solomon Reed appeared in folklore collections and spiritual songs. One song, collected from former slaves near Natchez, described a giant man walking silently through the night, carrying the weak and punishing the cruel. The refrain spoke of his calm, deliberate voice and his ability to disappear without a trace. These cultural artifacts reinforced the notion that Solomon's story was more than anecdotal. It had become symbolic, representing courage, justice, and resilience. By the end of Chapter 7, the Lost Files had firmly established Solomon Reed as a figure straddling the line between history and myth. He existed in letters, journals, and eyewitness accounts, yet no physical record confirmed his life beyond anecdotal evidence. The documentation suggested a man of extraordinary size and strength, driven by an unwavering moral code, capable of acts both protective and terrifying. Whether man or myth, the giant's legacy had become intertwined with the broader narrative of the South's transition from slavery to freedom, embodying both the horrors endured and the hope that survived. Chapter 8 begins with the culmination of these stories, as Solomon's legend grows into a regional phenomenon. Across Mississippi, Louisiana, and parts of Alabama, tales of the Phantom of the South circulate. By now, Solomon is no longer merely a man. He is a symbol, a ghostly guardian whose presence reminds people of both past injustice and the possibility of protection and justice. Reports from 1875 to 1880 describe sightings of the Phantom in rural areas, traveling at night along riverbanks, moving silently through forests, and appearing at moments of crisis. Communities consistently describe the same figure, an enormous man, calm, deliberate, moral, and elusive. Witnesses report that he often carries children or aids the elderly and infirm, guiding them safely past dangerous obstacles. Others speak of him confronting criminals or aggressors, using his physical presence alone to deter harm. In these years, Solomon's story begins to take on a near mythical quality. Songs, oral histories, and anecdotes depict him as both a man and a supernatural entity, a being capable of extraordinary acts, yet deeply grounded in a moral code. The Phantom of the South is described consistently across accounts, always embodying the same characteristics: height, strength, calm authority, moral clarity, and a willingness to intervene in moments of injustice.
And resilience. The Lost Files had firmly established Solomon Reed as a figure straddling the line between history and myth. He existed in letters, journals, and eyewitness accounts, yet no physical record confirmed his life beyond anecdotal evidence. The documentation suggested a man of extraordinary size and strength, driven by an unwavering moral code, capable of acts both protective and terrifying. Whether man or myth, the giant's legacy had become intertwined with the broader narrative of the South's transition from slavery to freedom, embodying both the horrors endured and the hope that survived. Begins with the culmination of these stories, as Solomon's legend grows into a regional phenomenon. Across Mississippi, Louisiana, and parts of Alabama, tales of the Phantom of the South circulate. By now, Solomon is no longer merely a man, he is a symbol, a ghostly guardian whose presence reminds people of both past injustice and the possibility of protection and justice. Reports from 1875 to 1880 describe sightings of the Phantom in rural areas, traveling at night along riverbanks, moving silently through forests, and appearing at moments of crisis. Communities consistently describe the same figure, an enormous man, calm, deliberate, moral, and elusive. Witnesses report that he often carries children or aids the elderly and infirm, guiding them safely past dangerous obstacles. Others speak of him confronting criminals or aggressors, using his physical presence alone to deter harm. In these years, Solomon's story begins to take on a near mythical quality. Songs, oral histories, and anecdotes depict him as both a man and a supernatural entity, a being capable of extraordinary acts, yet deeply grounded in a moral code. The Phantom of the South is described consistently across accounts, always embodying the same characteristics: height, strength, calm authority, moral clarity, and a willingness to intervene in moments of injustice. Families recount encounters where Solomon appeared from nowhere, aided them, and vanished as silently as he had arrived. Witnesses speak of footprints that seem impossibly large, yet sometimes vanish entirely. Some claim he could move through dense forests or across rivers with uncanny ease. Others recall hearing his deep, calm voice, issuing instructions or warnings that carried power beyond words alone.
By the early 1880s, the legend of Solomon Reed had become inseparable from the collective memory of freed communities across the South. Parents told stories of the Phantom at night, not merely as entertainment, but as moral instruction. Kindness and courage are rewarded, cruelty is punished, and there exists a force in the world capable of standing against injustice. Accounts describe him appearing during moments of crisis: a river crossing threatened by flood, a band of thieves approaching a family at dusk, or children lost in the woods. In every case, he acted decisively, with quiet authority, guiding the helpless to safety and confronting aggressors without hesitation. Travelers passing through Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama frequently reported glimpses of the Phantom. One witness, a teacher relocating her students after the war, wrote in a personal journal of seeing a man of extraordinary height moving silently through the tree line. He carried several children across a flooded field to safety, then vanished as the sun rose. Another report from a former soldier detailed an encounter in a swamp near Natchez, where a massive man emerged from the fog, instructing the soldier to retreat from a dangerous area. The soldier, unable to explain the figure's size and presence, later concluded he had encountered Solomon Reed. Folklore began to intertwine with fact. Stories emphasized both his physical size and moral presence, describing him as a force that could not be resisted by ordinary men. He became a living symbol of justice, embodying the ideals of courage, protection, and moral authority. Many accounts emphasized his gentle demeanor toward the innocent and his uncompromising stance against wrongdoing. This combination elevated Solomon beyond legend. He became an emblem of the South's struggle to reconcile the horrors of slavery with the promise of freedom. By the late 1880s, reports became rarer but more reverent. Families who had been helped continued to pass the stories down through generations. Children who had seen him carried the memory into adulthood, embedding Solomon's legend into local culture. His figure became so iconic that communities used references to him in prayers, spirituals, and even warnings. "Watch your steps, for Solomon walks among us." Scholars studying these oral histories recognize that the Phantom of the South served a dual purpose. He was both a real figure, possibly Solomon Reed himself performing heroic acts, and a cultural archetype symbolizing moral righteousness, protection, and resistance. The distinction between man and myth began to blur. Whether literal or symbolic, the stories instilled hope, reinforced courage, and warned oppressors that even in the absence of law, justice could exist. Accounts also suggested that Solomon interacted selectively with individuals who demonstrated moral integrity. He helped those seeking justice, cared for children, and ensured the safety of the vulnerable. Conversely, those attempting violence or exploitation found themselves confronted by his imposing figure, often without physical conflict. His very presence inspired fear, an indication of the power inherent in his size, strength, and moral authority. By the 1890s, the Phantom of the South was as much a cultural figure as a historical one. He had appeared in countless stories, each slightly different but unified by common traits: extraordinary height, immense strength, calm authority, moral clarity, and elusive movement. Scholars, folklorists, and descendants alike recognized Solomon Reed as a figure whose story bridged the human and mythic realms. Even without verifiable evidence, his influence on Southern culture remained undeniable.
By the turn of the century, the world that had known Solomon Reed had changed dramatically. Industrialization, urban growth, and the expansion of railroads reshaped the South, leaving forests, swamps, and remote fields increasingly uncommon. Yet even as the physical landscape changed, the legend persisted. People reported glimpses of a towering figure in rural areas, especially where freed families settled in isolation. Witnesses described him moving with silent purpose, always appearing when danger threatened and vanishing without a trace once the threat was removed. In 1901, a retired Union officer wrote a letter recalling an encounter he had witnessed 30 years earlier. He described a man of unimaginable size carrying children across a flooded field during a sudden storm. He noted that the man seemed capable of feats far beyond ordinary human strength, yet his actions were always measured and deliberate. The officer concluded that the man's influence was more moral than physical. The mere presence of Solomon Reed inspired courage, deterred violence, and ensured the safety of those in peril. Stories from this period reflect a man who had transcended the limitations of ordinary life. Children who had grown into adulthood remembered seeing a towering figure guiding travelers at night, protecting families, and confronting aggressors with quiet authority. Some reports described footprints that seemed impossibly large, fading as if swallowed by the earth itself. The consistency of these accounts, passed through multiple generations, reinforced the legend's power and the belief that Solomon Reed had become more than human. Folklore during this time increasingly depicted Solomon as a moral force. Songwriters and storytellers emphasized his protective nature, framing him as a guardian of justice in an unstable and often dangerous post-war society. Some stories described him appearing during times of natural disaster, guiding the helpless to safety. Others recounted him confronting bandits, corrupt officials, or opportunistic men, using his extraordinary presence to enforce justice without violence. His reputation grew to the point where mere rumors of his presence could prevent crimes from occurring. By 1910, the legend of Solomon Reed had become national, appearing in newspaper articles, letters, and oral histories. Scholars and journalists debated his existence, some dismissing him as folklore, others citing the consistency of eyewitness accounts as proof of a remarkable man. His story was referenced in academic journals discussing the social and moral fabric of the South during Reconstruction and the decades following. One particularly striking story comes from a family in rural Mississippi. They reported that in 1905, during a violent storm, an enormous figure appeared in their yard, leading their livestock to safety and shielding the children from falling debris. The family wrote that the man never spoke more than a few words, yet his calm authority and immense presence instilled a sense of safety and order. He vanished before morning, leaving behind only the memory and footprints that seemed to fade into the earth itself. Even in the decades that followed, as modern technology and urbanization spread, the figure of Solomon Reed persisted in cultural memory. Oral histories maintained his existence as both man and symbol, blending accounts of physical feats with moral intervention. His legend represented resilience, justice, and the enduring power of one individual standing against oppression.
By the 1920s, Solomon Reed had largely disappeared from eyewitness records, but the stories lived on. Families still recounted tales of a towering man appearing in moments of peril, carrying children, aiding the vulnerable, and confronting wrongdoers. His legend had grown to encompass both history and folklore, making him a symbol of moral justice and protection in the post-slavery South. In 1923, a teacher in Mississippi recorded oral histories from elders who had witnessed Solomon in their youth. They described a man of extraordinary height and strength, moving silently through forests and fields, always appearing at crucial moments. The teacher noted that every account emphasized his calm, deliberate voice and his unwavering commitment to justice. The children described him as larger than life, a figure who embodied both physical and moral power. Some accounts suggested that Solomon continued to operate in secret, helping families and travelers in remote areas. Others speculated that he had passed away quietly, his stories surviving only through memory, song, and legend. Regardless of his physical fate, the moral impact of his life endured. He became a figure representing hope, justice, and the unbroken spirit of those who had suffered under slavery. By mid-century, Solomon Reed had become a symbol in African American folklore. Stories of the giant of Virginia were included in collections of Southern legends, spirituals, and folk tales. Song lyrics referenced his height, strength, and protective nature, framing him as a moral guardian whose presence ensured safety and justice. Researchers studying the folklore noted that his story functioned as both historical testimony and moral instruction, reinforcing ideals of courage, compassion, and resistance to oppression.
Throughout the 20th century, the legend of Solomon Reed continued to inspire. He appeared in books, oral histories, and cultural references as a figure who transcended human limitations. His name became synonymous with protective power and moral authority. Descendants of freed families told stories of his interventions, ensuring that each generation understood the principles he represented: justice for the innocent, punishment for the cruel, and the presence of hope even in the darkest times. Even today, the story of Solomon Reed lives on. While historians debate the factual accuracy of each account, the legend remains powerful. He is remembered as a giant among men, a protector, and a symbol of resilience. Whether real or myth, the legacy of Solomon Reed demonstrates the enduring impact of courage, morality, and the human spirit.